Hello, friends. Do you know what a tipping point is? The history of ideas and movements follows a pattern, and the pattern that often repeats itself builds up to a tipping point within a culture. So here's the way it works. It's that you have a minority group or an idea that kind of comes from the fringe, and uh, it's somehow challenging the dominant way of doing things. And over years and over centuries, these voices from the fringe, they keep challenging and they keep building, and they build up to a critical mass at which they outweigh the dominant way of doing things. They outweigh their alternative. And that's the tipping point. It's what had previously not been considered by the majority of society now becomes a legitimate option to people. And the energy of most historic tipping points is almost always claimed by the economic and the political interests of the day. They try to somehow claim that energy and use it. The killing of George Floyd was the tipping point in many ways of the racial tension that has been a part of the culture that we live in for centuries. It was the tipping point. And now, as we see the Black Lives Matter movement, and as happens with most tipping points, the economic and the political interests of the day are trying to claim the energy of the movement for themselves. So it is crucial as Christians to recognize that the economic political interests of the day are going to try to push us as Christians to they're going to try to push us to align ourselves with one side or the other side. Like, are you with this crowd or that crowd, right or left? Whose agenda? Who do you stand with? As Christians, it's crucial that we differentiate our message from the crowd because we are the congregation. And so, depending on the day, depending on the issue, our message as the congregation may sound very similar to the crowd or very different from the crowd. The congregation's message will always be compromised if it's just generated by the political interests of the crowd, either side. If you're simply repeating the messages of either crowd, you're diluting the message of the congregation. So, as these cultural waves are clashing around us, how are we supposed to find sure footing to really be the congregation right now? How are followers of Jesus supposed to think and pray and live in these times? Well, what I want to offer you is not a one size fits all answer to everything that is happening, but I do want to offer you some resources. I'm offering you paradigms and perspectives that I pray will help all of us engage in ministry to a hurting world. And so I've put this material together in such a way that there are three parts and it's heavy material. So you may need to watch a video and then, like, just pause, uh, think, pray, digest. For some of you, you may watch the whole thing in one sitting, but for some of you, you may say, I watch one on Sunday and I'll come back on Tuesday and I'll watch the next one. And then I'll kind of digest that. And then I'll come back on Thursday and watch the next one. I deeply hope that all of you will take the time, please, to digest everything that I'm sharing with you here. I feel that it's very important for us as followers of Jesus. So thanks for taking the time to do this. Why does this question, this topic of race, matter so much? Well, there's a story captured in the book of Galatians that really answers the question well. But let me set it up for you. So, Jesus had ascended from earth to the heavens. The community of disciples were growing, and you remember Peter, the disciple of Jesus. Well, he's the guy who really opened the community of disciples up to people of all ethnicities, people of all races. Now, you may say, I thought Jesus was the guy who did that. Yeah, Jesus modeled that, but I don't know that the disciples latched onto it. Jesus shared table fellowship with anyone, anywhere. He drug his disciples across borders, like, come on, we're going over here. Uh, but it took a while for that to really catch on with the disciples, that vision of the kingdom of God. And so Peter was the guy. He had this vision. It's in the book of Acts, vision from God. And afterwards, he told the community of disciples, you all are well aware that it's against our law for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile, but God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. Now, you might think if you had a vision from God on that topic that it would kind of stick with you, but it didn't. See, Peter shared table fellowship with people of other ethnicities and races, anyone, anywhere, until some guys came along who Peter respected, who did not approve of those dirty Gentiles that he had been eating with. And so you know what Peter did? He drew back. He withdrew from sharing those meals with those dirty Gentiles. And you know what everyone else did who followed Peter? They followed him. Even big name people like Barnabas, you may remember that name, stopped eating with those dirty Gentiles. So the Apostle Paul comes along, he finds out what's been happening, and he gets right up in Peter's face. He's not going to have this segregation, this separation, this prejudice within the community of disciples. And he condemns Peter's behavior. He says, none of you are acting in line with the truth of the gospel. That's a huge statement. It's so important. None of you are acting in line with the truth of the gospel, that God reconciles people to himself and to one another. So this situation with prejudice, segregation, racism, it didn't line up. The Jesus who eats with anyone, anywhere, and crosses borders to create this one new humanity, the reconciled community, they can't draw back even a little. And so that's why this matters. So, how do we engage in ministry to our hurting world? Well, we have to start by knowing ourselves, being honest with ourselves. And that means identifying our conditioning, our dominance, our distance, and our denial in order to engage in ministry to this hurting world. So I want to unpack that a little bit. So acknowledging, identifying our conditioning. Our conditioning is our view of how things work and what we think will make things better. And it's shaped by where we grew up and who our friends were and what voices we were listening to and what we were taught. So, for instance, I did not begin to even scratch the surface of the church's complicity in racism until I was in seminary. And I also found out that there were large portions of the history of the United States that I had never been taught. They had just been left out of my history classes as I grew up in Wyoming. So I was taught next to nothing about the doctrine of discovery and redlining and Jim Crow laws, segregation, mass incarceration. I didn't know what happened with Brown v. Board of Education. I didn't know that the Federal Housing Administration wrote Black people out of the ability to even get a home loan for decades. Like, if you can't own a home, then you don't build equity, you don't send your children to college, they don't get the same jobs, so much more. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. That was my conditioning. I had a simple view that said, well, slavery happened, that was bad, but there was a civil war and that ended it. And then Martin Luther King fixed everything else, so now we're good. That was my conditioning. I only learned a partial history of the United States. So I couldn't possibly understand the pain that Black people are feeling and expressing right now. If you are a Tillamook native, then you grew up in an area where the generation before you tolerated, if not accepted, the Ku Klux Klan, especially in the 1920s. The KKK in the 1920s enjoyed phenomenal growth in this area, the Tillamook area. And the attitudes behind that growth, they are not easily changed. They tend to permeate communities. So as you acknowledge your conditioning, if you're a Tillamook native, you probably knew some of the prior generation. You were likely possibly exposed to some of those attitudes of prejudice and racism. Now, our conditioning is not only shaped by our upbringing, it's shaped by the voices that we're listening to right now. So it's every time you turn on the radio, talk radio, or cable news, or every time you hop on social media, conditioning is happening. Are you listening to voices from all sides and filtering it through prayer and scripture, or are you just listening to one side of the conversation? These are all versions of disciple making happening in real time. It's not like disciple making only happens with Jesus and with the church. Disciple making happens everywhere. There's this old song, read your Bible, pray every day, and you'll grow, grow, grow. Uh, really, if you are not engaged in those simple Christian disciplines right now, but every day you hop in the car, you're flicking on the political talk radio or hopping on social media constantly or turning on the cable news, the chances of finding sure footing as a follower of Jesus as these cultural waves clash, your chances are low. Martin Luther King had this list of 10 requirements for his adherents. And the very first one, he said, meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. That was the very first one. So recognizing our conditioning means recognizing our own implicit bias. It means asking yourself, how many of my friends are white people? How many of my friends are Black people? How many of my friends and loved ones are police officers? And how's that touching me, affecting me, even in ways I'm not aware of? Have I aligned myself with a certain political party so thoroughly that I'm probably going to just go with whatever side, whatever angle they take? All of that shapes the way that we think about the stories that we are seeing every day and what we think will actually make things better. And that conditioning impacts the spiritual significance that we attach to what we see happening in the world. And it shapes what we pay attention to and what we ignore as we read our Bible. To engage in ministry to our hurting world, we need to identify our own dominance. Now, that word dominance might sound strong to you. You might say, "Dominance? My life is hard. What are you talking about?" Think of it this way. There are things about your life that I simply assume as a part of who we are. The ability to read, the ability to write, drive a car, get an education, earn an income, get a home loan, feel safe. There are things about your life that not everyone on this planet enjoys, but they're just normal to you. You assume them. Now, some people use the word privilege here to describe this, and that's kind of a buzzwordy word right now. And sometimes privilege is spoken about kind of like if you're privileged, you're bad, you're wrong. Uh, Privilege is innately wrong. That's kind of the way it's spoken about sometimes. But the way the Bible talks about privilege, our dominance, our power, it's it's the stewardship of privilege that actually matters. It's what we do with it. Philippians 2, verse 5. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, dominance, privilege, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So, do you notice what Jesus does with his dominance, with his privilege? If we can't recognize our dominance and just admit it, we will likely fail to empty ourselves, to humble ourselves, to lay down our privilege for the sake of others. To engage in ministry to our hurting world, we need to identify our own distance. Here's what I'm getting at. Even if you plunge yourself into learning all of the history of the United States that you were never taught, even if you dig in deep to building relationships with a whole bunch of Black people so that you can feel the pain that's being expressed right now, if you are not a Black person, you are still a little bit like a tourist in their world. And we could say that of any culture. Uh, Specifically here, when their stories are too painful, or when you become overwhelmed by the history, or you encounter something that you disagree with, your distance. You can simply walk away from it all. A Black person cannot. So, just like every culture, there are methods of solving problems. There are words that are used, and food, and customs that are different from your own. And all of that creates a distance. And in order to engage in ministry with the world, we have to recognize that distance and name that distance. It just is. To engage in ministry to our hurting world, we have to recognize our own denial. In denial, rather than feeling the pain of someone in their world, in their context, we attempt to reframe their experience according to our terms. So we ask the hurting person to adapt to us. We say, "Oh, that's not going well for you. Well, you should make the changes that I think that you should make." So we think other people have to make the changes, not us. It's denial. Right now, every form of media is buzzing with painful anecdotal stories of violence and wrongdoing on every side. And you remember the energy generated by a tipping point is so often claimed by the economic and the political interests of the day. And so, depending who you are paying attention to right now, who you are listening to, you're probably seeing stories and pictures and reports of police brutality against Black people, police brutality against protesters, protesters looting, protesters doing violence against police officers. You could be seeing any number of those things. And all of those actions are founded on the same idea, which is that peace and justice can be achieved through violence. And none of those actions are following the way of Jesus. The pain that's being expressed right now by Black people, it might begin to make more sense to you. You might undo some of your denial as you learn a broader history, or as you read the more recent stories of even children and youth and young people who are no longer with us. People like Nicholas Hayward, Tamir Rice, Tyre King, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Cameron Tillman, Jordan Edwards, Kawane Carrington, Deonta Farrow, Elijah McClain, and more. Heartbreaking stories. In denial, we refuse to feel the pain of someone else in their context, in their world. So an example of this might be if you say, I might have listened to what Black Lives Matter had to say before the looting started, but when they started looting, they lost me. Of course, they're going to experience higher levels of incarceration if that's what they do. That is denial. Or another version of denial might be, well, after seeing all this footage of police brutality, I really don't care what happens to police anymore. Like, if they get hurt by the protesters or whoever's coming after them, that's just a drop in the bucket compared to all the brutality they've brought down on others. Both of those are denial. They're both denial. It's I reframe someone else's experience according to my own terms. And so, if we are going to engage in ministry to a hurting world, we have to be able to recognize our own denial. Sin and evil are not only personal, they are systemic. They infect structures. Spiritual director Lynn Baker says that nearly every behavioral problem on planet Earth within the world can be boiled down to two problems, she says: fear and greed. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with her. You may parse it out a little different. You may boil the problems down to something else. In a general sense, most Christians boil it down to the same root problem, and that is sin. They say, isn't sin the problem? Whatever it is that infects humanity, it doesn't just remain at the personal level. It gets inside of our systems and inside of our structures. So while sin may originate in the human heart and be very personal, those same humans who sin, they build societies. And whatever sin dominates the hearts of the people will get inside of the building blocks, the structures of the society that they create. It just happens. So they create structures that reinforce whatever sins dominate their hearts. So, an early example among many is the fact that the US Constitution, that declares all men are created equal, also names Black people and others as 3/5 of a person. So, this sin of racism and prejudice and white supremacy, it's embedded deep within the building blocks of society. The most scholars, they recognize that there are three prongs to racism. There's prejudice, there's power structures, and there are societal norms. And you put those together, and racism becomes this thing where you see a certain people group as inferior to the dominant group. It's in this case, the white way is the right way. We are better. It doesn't have to be white. It could be any various number of situations, but racism goes beyond interpersonal to the systemic, and it starts to get inside of the cultural fabric and the norms of society. And the Apostle Paul actually addresses sin and evil in this way. He writes about our struggle against the principalities and powers, Ephesians 6:12. He's looking at how sin and evil get inside of the customs, the routines, the patterns, the laws, the systems of humanity, and the destruction becomes exponential. And it's not hard to understand when you think about it in this way. If I wanted to mess up humanity, how can I do the most damage? Well, it's not just uh, bink, I got that person, bink, I got that person. It's how can we get inside of the fabric and the structure and the system so that we go poof, and we just exponential disaster, mess everything up. Now, you may say, okay, but I still think sin is personal. I still think sin is individual. Like, I'm responsible for me. I shouldn't have to say sorry for something that I didn't do. Isn't that right? Well, in the 21st century, there are many Christians who have become imbalanced in their stand against sin. So they express concern, they express moral outrage about individual acts of sin, but they ignore or they even participate in evil social structures. But the Bible condemns both. So there was a recent Barna study done. They do a lot of studies of Christians and what's happening in the Christian world. And they found that 38% of white practicing Christians, only 38% think that the US has a race problem. So that's about a third. About a third of white practicing Christians would say, yeah, we still have a problem. We got a problem here. Now, you go ask black practicing Christians that same question. 78% of black practicing Christians say the US has a race problem. So that's more than twice the percentage. And this survey that they did, it took place before the killing of George Floyd. So it shows us we've got a problem, and the problem is not just out there in the crowd. The problem is inside of us. It's even within the congregation. They found this Barna study, they found that 3 out of 5 white practicing Christians say, well, if there is a problem, it's just personal. They still call it personal. 61%, they say it's individual, it's their beliefs, it's their prejudice. It's not inside of our systemic social structures. It's just a personal thing those people have. Now, you go ask black people that same question, black practicing Christians, and you get almost the opposite result. 66%, 2/3 say no, it's systemic. So you got 61% of white Christians saying it's personal. You've got 66% of black practicing Christians saying it's systemic. It is historically built into this society and this society's institutions. So there are 70% of black practicing Christians who are motivated to address racial injustice. But there's only 1/3 of white practicing Christians who can say the same. So we clearly have this disconnect, and it's got to break the heart of Jesus. This brings us to the end of part 1, and it primes us for part 2. Now, you don't have to wait until next Sunday to watch part 2. You can watch it right now if you're ready, or you can watch it tomorrow night. Now, I did not create part 2. Part 2 is a 17-minute video that's a very condensed history of what happened with race in the last 400 years. It's a very short version of that history, but I made it part 2 because it is broad in its scope and it covers a lot of material really quickly, so you can grab onto, oh, it's the stuff that I didn't learn until I was in my 30s. I didn't know this stuff. It's put out by someone who you probably know well. It's put out by someone who if you have children, you probably have trusted your children with this person. It's put out by the creator of Veggie Tales. So watch that video and ask yourself if sin does not get inside of humanity's systems and structures. And please don't skip part 2. Please. This is a learning journey. I admit, this is a different kind of sermon, and we don't even have to call it a sermon. This is a learning journey, and it is crucial. So it is okay if it feels jarring, disorienting. I've been on this learning journey related to issues of race for years now, and sometimes it still feels jarring, disorienting to me. So be willing to learn, be willing to grow, be willing to change as you follow Jesus. Love you, friends.